The sun was unrelenting that summer in Montana, baking the earth until the soil cracked and the air shimmered with heat. Jake Carson was out in the pasture before sunrise, his shirt already clinging to him by mid-morning. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, but these days, the Carson name didn't carry the same weight it once did. Drought had killed most of his grazing grass, the bank was circling like vultures over his overdue loans, and the cattle market had been dropping for months. Jake's boots were worn thin, his hat stained with sweat, and his spirit was hanging by a thread. He had been loading hay bales into the bed of his rusted pickup, each lift a reminder of how little energy he had left, when a shadow blocked out the blinding sun. At first, he thought it was one of the ranch hands from a neighboring spread, but as he straightened up, his gaze traveled higher and higher until he met a pair of sharp green eyes. Standing before him was Marlene Doyle, the kind of woman you didn't forget after meeting once. She was taller than most men in the county, broad-shouldered, with her long black hair pulled into a braid that swung past her back. Her boots were polished but dusty from riding, and her denim shirt clung to arms that looked more capable of wrangling a steer than half the cowboys Jake knew. Marlene Doyle was a name that carried weight. She owned the Doyle Ranch, a property so massive it seemed to go on forever, with fences that could probably be seen from the next state. Her late husband had been a rodeo champion and a business genius, and together they'd built an empire. But he'd been gone 5 years now, and Marlene had run the place single-handedly since. People said she was as tough as barbed wire and twice as sharp. There were rumors she could toss a 60-pound sack of feed over her shoulder without breaking stride, and that she'd once pulled a stuck tractor out of the mud using nothing but her pickup and pure stubbornness. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, unsure why she'd come. They'd spoken a few times at cattle auctions, exchanged polite nods at the feed store, but they weren't friends. She wasn't the type to drop in for neighborly chatter. She studied him for a moment, her gaze scanning him like she was sizing up a horse she might buy. "Jake," she said finally, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made men listen. "I need a husband, and you need a strong daughter." The hay bale slipped from his hands, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. "Ma'am?" he asked, blinking. He wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Marriage proposals weren't something he got on a regular basis, especially not from women like her. She took a step forward, closing the space between them. The scent of leather, hay, and faint lavender reached him, and it was oddly disarming. "You heard me," she said. "I'm not looking for romance or a pretty story. I've got a ranch that's too big for one person, and you've got a ranch that's dying on the vine. You marry me, we combine what we've got. In return, I want a partner who'll pull his weight, and one day, give me a daughter strong enough to inherit all this and keep the Doyle name alive." Jake stared at her, trying to process the bluntness of her words. He'd expected maybe an offer to buy some of his land, or a suggestion they share labor during calving season. But marriage? That wasn't even in the realm of possibilities he'd imagined. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally said, "That's a broken bar, not something you just say to a man out of nowhere." She smirked slightly, though there was no humor in her eyes. "I don't do small talk, Jake. Life's too short for it. You've got skills. You work hard. You're decent. That's all I need in a husband. And you need someone who can keep you from losing everything your family built." There was no flirtation in her tone, no coy glances, no batting of eyelashes. This was a business deal in her mind, an exchange of needs. But there was something else beneath her words, something Jake couldn't quite put his finger on. A loneliness, maybe. Or a sense of urgency, as if she'd been holding on to this decision for a while. He felt his pulse quicken, though not entirely from surprise. Marlene Doyle was intimidating, yes, but she was also respected by everyone in the county. She had a presence that made you believe she could handle anything life threw at her. And now she was standing here, telling him she'd decided he was worth joining forces with. "Why me?" Jake finally asked, his voice low. She shrugged one shoulder. Because I've watched you work. You don't cut corners. You don't complain. And you've been running yourself into the ground trying to keep your place alive. I respect that. I don't need a man to take care of me, I need one to stand beside me. And maybe, just maybe, I'd like a daughter who inherits both our grit. Her gaze locked onto his, unflinching, and for a moment, Jake forgot to breathe. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around them. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed lazily, and the smell of dust filled the air. Jake bent down, picked up the hay bale he'd dropped, and tossed it into the truck bed. He needed time to think. This wasn't the kind of offer you accept or refuse without careful consideration. "I'll a broken bar think about it," he said slowly, the words tasting strange on his tongue. Marlene nodded once, as if that was all she'd expected. "Do that," she said. Then she turned, mounted her horse in one smooth motion, and rode off, leaving him standing there with the sun beating down and his thoughts spinning like a windmill in a storm. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft creaks of the old house as it settled in the night. Her words kept replaying in his head, not just the proposal but the way she'd said them, firm, certain, like she'd already decided what the outcome would be. He thought about the ranch, how the barn roof leaked when it rained, how the fences sagged in places he hadn't had time to fix, how the bank had called twice that week about payments. And he thought about her ranch, of fences straight as a ruler, barns painted fresh every spring, cattle that looked healthy and well-fed. Together, their land would be unstoppable. Separately, a broken bar he wasn't sure how long his would last. The next morning, the sun rose over the plains in a pale wash of gold, and Jake was already up, sipping coffee as he watched the horizon. He told himself it was just business. If he married her, it would be about saving his ranch, about securing the future, about combining resources. But in the back of his mind, he knew it would be more complicated than that. Marlene Doyle wasn't the type to fade into the background, and being married to her would mean being part of a life much larger than his own. He didn't know if he was ready. But he knew he couldn't ignore the offer. Jake spent the next 7 days trying to bury himself in work, thinking maybe hard labor would quiet the noise in his head. But every fence post he drove, every water trough he cleaned, every sunrise he watched from the saddle brought him back to the same question: was Marlene Doyle's proposal madness, or was it salvation? He'd always been a man who made decisions based on logic, but there was something about this that pulled at him beyond numbers and business. It wasn't just about saving his land anymore. It was about what life would look like standing beside a woman like her. The Doyle Ranch wasn't a place Jake visited often, but when he finally drove his truck down the long gravel road toward her property, he was struck by the sheer size of it. Miles of fencing stretched across rolling hills, cattle dotted the pastures like slow-moving shadows, and the massive red barn looked as if it had been built yesterday. The house itself was even more impressive, a two-story ranch-style home with a wraparound porch and a view of the mountains that made the whole place look like it belonged on a postcard. Jake pulled up, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, staring at the front steps. This wasn't just another conversation. Whatever happened here today would change the rest of his life. Marlene was leaning against a fence post near the corral, her head tilted low against the afternoon sun. She didn't wave or smile when he approached. Instead, she watched him with the same steady gaze she'd given him a week earlier, as if measuring whether he was truly ready for what he was about to say. "You here to work?" she asked, "or to stay?" The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Jake's throat felt dry. He cleared it before answering. "If I say yes, a broken bar, what happens?" Marlene's eyes didn't waver. "You move in. We run both ranches together. We make a family. And when we have a daughter, she grows up learning to ride, rope, and run an empire." Her words were as direct as before, but now there was an edge of something else, not desperation, but conviction. She wasn't selling him a dream, she was laying out the terms of a partnership. Jake took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "You really believe this will work?" he asked. Marlene stepped closer until she was only a foot away. "I don't gamble, Jake. I don't hope for things. I make them happen. And I know we'd make this work because we both want the same thing, a future we can control, not one the bank or the weather decides for us." They stood there in the late afternoon light, the sound of horses shifting in the corral behind her. Jake felt the weight of his decision pressing down. He thought about the years he'd spent alone on his ranch, fighting to keep it alive. He thought about the debt notices in his desk drawer, the way the house felt too quiet at night, the way every problem seemed to land squarely on his shoulders. And then he thought about what it might be like to share all of it at work, the decisions, the responsibility with someone who wouldn't break under the weight. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm in." Marlene didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She extended her hand, and Jake took it. Her grip was firm, solid, the kind of handshake you remembered. They didn't talk about love, or vows, or any of the things people usually discussed before marriage. Instead, they spent the next hour walking the property, talking about grazing rotations, herd sizes, and how to merge their operations without wasting resources. By the time the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, they'd already started making plans for the future. Word spread fast in a place like theirs. By the end of the week, every feed store, diner, and saloon in 3 counties knew that Jake Carson and Marlene Doyle were going to be married. Some people laughed. Some shook their heads and said it would never work. Others whispered that maybe it made perfect sense, 2 of the most stubborn, hard-working people they knew combining forces. Jake ignored the talk. He'd never lived his life by other people's opinions, and he wasn't about to start now. The wedding was small, just a handful of close neighbors and the county clerk who doubled as the officiant. Marlene wore a simple cream dress with her boots, her long braid draped over one shoulder. Jake wore his best shirt and a clean hat. They stood under the wide Montana sky with nothing but the wind and the sound of cattle in the distance. When the clerk pronounced them husband and wife, Marlene didn't cry or kiss him dramatically. She simply looked at him, nodded once, and said, "Let's get to work." Jake couldn't help but smile. It was the most fitting start they could have had. Merging the 2 ranches wasn't easy. There were long days when they argued over which equipment to keep, nights when they collapsed into bed too tired to talk, and mornings when the sheer amount of work ahead felt overwhelming. But there were also moments that made it clear they'd made the right choice. Like the time a late spring blizzard hit and they worked side by side for 18 hours straight, moving cattle to shelter and breaking ice in water troughs until their hands went numb. Or the day Marlene drove his old tractor through the mud to pull out a stuck delivery truck, laughing the whole time while Jake tried to keep up. Slowly, Jake began to see parts of her that most people didn't. She was still the towering, unshakable woman everyone in the county respected, but she also had a quiet way of tending to injured calves, of checking their fences herself instead of sending someone else, of sitting on the porch at night with a cup of coffee just to watch the stars. And she learned things about him too, how he hummed under his breath when he worked alone, how he could tell the weather by the smell of the wind, how fiercely loyal he was to the land his grandfather had built from nothing. Months turned into a year, and the ranch thrived. Debt was paid down, barns were repaired, pastures were lush from careful management. Neighbors began to come around, not just to see if it was working but to ask advice. Jake and Marlene never became the kind of couple who showed affection in public, but there was an ease between them, a trust that was as solid as the land beneath their boots. They didn't just share work, they shared victories and setbacks, laughter and silence, a life built on grit and mutual respect. And then, one crisp autumn morning, Marlene told him she was expecting. Jake stood there in the kitchen, coffee mug halfway to his lips, staring at her as if she'd just told him the sky had turned green. She didn't smile, but there was a warmth in her eyes he'd never seen before. "Looks like that strong daughter's on her way," she said. Jake set down the mug and crossed the room in 3 strides, wrapping his arms around her for the first time in their marriage without thinking about it. For a moment, the walls they'd both built around themselves didn't matter. All that mattered was the future and the life they were about to bring into the world. The county had been curious before, but now they were downright fascinated. Everyone wanted to know what the child of Marlene Doyle and Jake Carson would be like. Jake didn't care about the speculation. He was too busy making sure the ranch was in its best shape yet, preparing for the day their daughter would one day ride out onto the land and call it hers. And when that day came, he knew she wouldn't just inherit cattle and fences, she'd inherit the combined strength of 2 people who had chosen each other not out of convenience, but out of the knowledge that together, they were unstoppable.